All right, welcome everyone to the 2023 Dianoia Annual Seminar in Ethics and Metaethics, featuring Professor Lara Buchak. My name is Nevin Kleiman-Higa. I'm a Senior Research Fellow here at Dianoia and the organizer of our seminar series. A few notes before we begin. This event is being recorded, and after the seminar, it will be put on our YouTube page. Professor Buchak's talk will go for about an hour, and we'll have about an hour for Q&A. If you have a question that you'd like to ask during the Q&A, please message me directly and I will add you to the queue. Finally, many of you will know that it's a bittersweet moment for us here at Dianoia. Australian Catholic University established the Dianoia Institute of Philosophy in April 2019 to build a world-leading research center in analytic philosophy. This initiative was highly successful. We've hired incredible staff who have gone above and beyond the research goals that were laid out for our institute, and we've forged fruitful connections with departments and philosophers around the world, including through this annual seminar series, which we launched in 2021. Then a little under 2 months ago, the university announced a plan to disestablish the Dianoia Institute. While we're all devastated by this decision, I can think of no better way for us to honor Dianoia than by doing philosophy together. And I'm looking forward to hearing Professor Buchak's talk and engaging with it in the Q&A. So this will be the final seminar in our annual seminar series. Now, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Lara Buchak is professor of philosophy at Princeton University. Her research interests include decision theory, social choice theory, epistemology, ethics, and the philosophy of religion. Her book, Risk and Rationality, explores how an individual ought to take risk into account when making decisions. And she's currently doing very interesting work extending this research in decision theory to problems in ethics, which is what prompted me to extend this invitation to her to present the annual seminar in ethics and metaethics. So please join me in welcoming Lara Buchak to present the third and final Dianoia Annual Seminar in Ethics and Metaethics. All right, over to you, Lara.
All right, well, thanks so much for having me. I'm both sad and honored to be here. Sad, obviously, because I've been watching the Institute and what's been happening for the past few months, and it's such a great group, and I'm just obviously, yeah, really sad and disappointed to see it, and really wish you guys all the best. And I'm also honored and excited to be here to be able to talk with this amazing group. So let's do some philosophy, as Nevin said. So the topic of my talk in general is what we might call aggregation problems. What I'm going to show is there's a certain phenomenon that comes up in 3 different domains: the domain of decision theory, the domain of social choice theory, and the domain of epistemology. And there's like a standard way to handle this phenomenon, but I'm going to argue that in every single case, a different way is better. And along the way, we'll see that actually these 3 phenomena all have something in common, and the one way of handling it has a unifying feature, and my way of handling it has a unifying feature. So we're going to then sort of close by talking about how to think about aggregation problems in general. So what is an aggregation problem? The very basic level, it's a problem of how to go from various value bearers, from the value that you find at each of these value bearers, to a single evaluation. So here are some examples that are not the examples I'm going to talk about. Let's say you have an Olympic committee evaluating gymnasts on the basis of performance on several events. So the value bearers, namely the gymnastics events, the individual performances. You have the evaluation on each event, and you want to know if a gymnast gets certain scores on these 4 events, what's her overall performance? You want to know this so you can compare her to other gymnasts. Or maybe you have some deans evaluating departments on the basis of individual faculty research profiles. The locations, the value bearers are the faculty research profiles. You want to know how to go from the 10 profiles in the department to a single evaluation of the department. Or we might have a group of engineers. They know the strength of various chain links, and they want to figure out if you put the links together, what the overall strength of the chain. So these are all aggregation problems. Now, aggregation problems come up in 3 domains that I am going to talk about. One is decision theory. Decision theory deals with how to evaluate gambles. So the value bearers are various states of the world, and you want to know how to go from the value you might get in each possible state of the world to a single value for the gamble. In social choice theory, the value bearers are individuals. So we have a society with, say, 100 people. We know how each of these people are doing. We want to figure out how to go from how each of these people are doing to a single evaluation of our society. In epistemology, the value bearers are various possible states of the world in which my beliefs are true or false. And I want to know how to go from the truth or falsity of my beliefs in the various states of the world to a single evaluation for the beliefs I have now. Now, in each of these domains, we don't like value to be spread out. So in decision theory, we don't like value to be spread out among the possible states. In other words, we don't like risk, or at least some people don't like risk. That's a possible thing you might not like. In epistemology, we don't like the sort of extremes of belief to be spread out among the various states. We don't want to be wildly wrong in some states, even if we're wildly right in some other states. And in social choice theory, we don't like things to be unequal. So we don't want some people to have a lot of money or well-being and other people to have very little. We'd rather everybody have some average amount of well-being. Okay, and so in each of these domains, there's a standard way to capture this phenomenon of not liking things to be spread out. And we're going to go through these domains one by one, and I'm going to argue that in each of these, a better way is available. None of the arguments from each domain hang on arguments from other domains, so you might end up like agreeing with me that my strategy is better with respect to decision theory and epistemology, say, but think my strategy is bad with respect to social choice theory. The overall thing I want to convince you of is that these 2 ways of handling not liking things to be spread out are actually not identical. They're really different, they're formally different, and they're philosophically different. They end up giving us very different commitments about how we value things. So like, even if you don't agree with me about how we should ultimately handle the phenomena, I want to stress the point that this is a real choice. And I think people haven't, in general, identified the other strategy I'm going to argue for as a live option. So, weak version of my talk, there's another strategy that's a live option. Strong version of my talk, we should take that strategy. Okay, so I'm just going to talk through each of the domains individually. Some of you might be like very, very familiar with my work in one or the other of these domains, so just bear with me if you are. Okay, so the first domain, decision theory. As I've said, decision theory deals with the evaluation of gambles, where a gamble is an assignment of outcomes to possible states of the world. In this case, we can just talk about lotteries, which assign probabilities to the various states of the world. So for example, and I'm going to switch over to my document camera here. Hopefully everybody can see this. I'm going to have some visuals to talk about these examples. So here are 2 gambles. Gamble 1. Can you guys all see that? Thumbs up if you can. Okay, great. So the first gamble, 1/3 probability of $100, a 1/3 probability of $200, and a 1/3 probability of $300. The second gamble just gives you $200 with probability 1. Okay, so the question for decision theory is, how should we aggregate these values that you find in various states of the world to come up with a single value for the gamble, where value corresponds to which gamble you prefer. So gambles you prefer more have higher value. So the initial thought is we should maximize expected value. In other words, take the area under the curve here, just take an average of the dollar values in each case. So 1/3 times $100 plus 1/3 times $100 plus 1/3 times $300 is $200. $200 times 1 is also $200. So these 2 gambles have the same expected value. But worry, most people aren't indifferent between these 2 gambles. In fact, most people prefer this gamble, the sure thing. Some people prefer this first one, but the point is, not everyone is perfectly indifferent. Okay, so this is called risk aversion, or risk seeking, if you prefer the first gamble. So the standard response to this phenomenon is to say, well, we don't ultimately value money. We value utility, which is a diminishing marginal function of money. So in other words, let's say the utility I attach to $100 is 100. The utility I attach to $200 is 200. But the utility I attach to $300 is something lower, maybe 270. So this is really the area under the utility curve. When you compare these two, you see that this one has a higher average. Okay, so that's the standard response. But, and this is what I've argued for in my book, worry, there are actually two different reasons why we might prefer less spread out distributions. There are two different reasons we might prefer distribution 1 to distribution 2. On the one hand, we might get in money. So as we get more money, we might value additional bits of money less. So if I already have $200, I might not like the next $100 quite as much. Or different reason, I might pay more attention to worse cases than better cases. So just to like illustrate the difference between these two things, here are two people really only needs one coffee to stay awake. Any coffee after that just like makes him jittery. So he prefers 1 cup of coffee to a coin flip between no coffee or 2 coffees. On the other hand, person 2 likes each cup of coffee as much as the last. Each one increases his awakeness level. But when he considers the coin flip between 1 cup of coffee, the coin flip between 0 or 2 cups of coffee and just getting one for sure, he says, well, the possibility that I might get no coffee at all, that's just not worth it. I don't want to put very much weight on the fact that I might get 2 coffees. It's not worth it to me to take this gamble. So these are intuitively two different reasons we might prefer less spread out distributions. So in response to wanting to handle the second kind of reason, I've proposed what I call risk-weighted expected utility. So let's go back to these two gambles. Here's like another way to think about what these gambles are saying. This one says, I'm going to get $100 with probability 1. I might additionally, with probability 2/3, get another $100. And I might additionally, with probability 1/3, get another $100. Well, how much value should I attach to that? I know I'm getting at least $100, so I should give weight 1 to that possibility. But now, how much weight should I give to the possibility that I'll get an additional $100 with probability 2/3? Well, if I'm a cautious kind of person, that possibility might not weight very heavily for me. So I might say, I'll give it some weight, but not much weight. Maybe I'll give it, about 50% weight, or weight 4/9, let's just say. And what about the possibility that I might get an additional $100 beyond that? Well, there's only a 1/3 chance of that. That doesn't, I don't care about that much. I care about it a little bit. So I'll give it even less weight. I'll give it weight 1/9. So now the value for me is the area under the curve here. And as we can see, it's going to be less than the area under the curve here. So there's sort of two different ways to explain why gamble 1 is worse than gamble 2. There's this way where I've like shrunk the values of the higher monetary outcomes, and there's this way where I've shrunk the weights that attach to lower probability good outcomes. Okay. And so the way I like to think of, so on my view, you don't just have utility values that measure how much you like various outcomes and probabilities that measure how likely various outcomes are. You also have a risk function of probabilities, which measures how much you care about the top p portion of outcomes. So if you assign value 1/9 to 1/3, that means the top 1/3 of outcomes only get weight 1/9 for you. And in general, we might have someone with a risk function of, say, R of p equals p squared. This is someone who gives proportionally less weight to the top p portion of outcomes as p gets smaller and smaller. So this is a person that doesn't like risk in the sense of giving less weight to outcomes at the top and more weight to outcomes at the bottom. Conversely, we might have somebody who gives, say, R of p equals p to the 1/2. This person gives proportionally more weight to outcomes at the top than outcomes at the bottom. Okay. And I sort of think of the risk function as capturing the following feature of instrumental rationality. So instrumental rationality is supposed to tell you how to take the means to your ends. And we might identify your ends with the utility function and your means with the probability function. So what is it to take the means to your ends? Well, it's really easy to say what taking the means to your ends consists in if you know what's going to happen. So if I know there's beer in the fridge and I want a beer, to take the means to my ends is to go to the fridge and grab the beer. But what is it to take the means to my ends when I don't know what's going to happen, but only assign probabilities to various outcomes? Well, I contend that there's not one single answer. Instead, each person has to have a strategy for taking the means to their ends. And the strategy is going to say something like, which do I value more? Getting something I kind of like for sure, or having the possibility of getting something I really like at the expense of getting something I don't like that much. So rationality can't tell you which thing is better. It's up to you. And that's what the risk function measures. It measures what's your strategy for taking the means to your ends. In other words, like, how much concern do I put on what happens to the my future selves, the future 1/3 best off of my future selves, for example. So, in this gamble, 1/3 of future Laras get 100, 1/3 of future Laras get 200, 1/3 of future Laras get 300. It's up to me how to think about how much weight should I put on the best off future Lara as opposed to the worst off future Lara. Okay. So expected utility maximization is a special case of this. If the risk function is linear, then probabilities just count, outcomes count in proportion to their probabilities. If the risk function is convex, then, as I said, you care proportionally less and less about outcomes that are realized in fewer and fewer future states of the world. And if you have a concave risk function, you're risk inclined, you care proportionally more and more about outcomes that are realized in smaller and smaller portions of future states. And a limit case of risk avoidance is maxi-min, where you only care about the worst possible outcome, or you only care about outcomes if they have probability 1. And the limit case of risk inclination is maxi-max, where you only care about the best possible outcome. Okay. So on my view, 3 things are up to a rational individual: his utility function, his probability function, and his risk function. And you can have risk-averse preferences in one of 2 ways. You can either have a concave utility function, you can either be like this, or you can have a convex risk function, you can be like this, or some combination of the 2. And the key point here is that we can capture the difference between risk-averse preferences that result from saturation, from the person who likes just one cup of coffee and no more, and risk-averse preferences that stem from caring more about worse states of the world. Okay, so that's not liking spread in decision theory. If we don't like outcomes to be spread out, we're risk averse. There's a standard way to handle that, which is to say, as bits of money as bits of money increase, you care about them less. I propose an alternative way to explain risk aversion, namely that you give more weight to worst possible states of the world than better possible states of the world. Okay, so that's the first domain. That'll be the longest one, since, as you'll see, we're going to somewhat repeat the same points in these other domains. Okay, so next, formal epistemology. So in formal epistemology, what we're evaluating is beliefs or credences. I'm actually just going to talk about the beliefs case here, but there's some interesting things to say there too. So one way to think about a belief and which beliefs I should adopt is this picture that comes from Isaac Levi. He's sort of picking up on a point of William James. William James says, like, basically there are two things I care about in the matter of beliefs. I care about believing true things, and I also care about not believing false things. The way Levi thinks about this is like, I care about believing things that are true, and I'd also rather believe more informative things rather than less. So here's an example. Let's say there's a presidential election coming up. There are three candidates: candidate A, candidate B, and candidate C. Excuse me. So there are a number of beliefs I can hold. I could just, for example, believe that A will win, or believe that B will win, or believe that C will win. I could instead believe some disjunction, so I could believe that A or B will win. Or I could believe the least informative thing, namely that A or B or C will win. So what Levi says is that each belief carries a certain amount of information in the state in which it's true or false. So basically the amount of information it carries is like the states of the world that are ruled out by it. And it's a positive value. It's like the true states of the world that are ruled out versus the false states of the world that are ruled out. So for example, let's say I believe that A will win and A in fact wins. Then that's informativeness value 2/3. I've ruled out two states, B wins and C wins, and I'm correct. Okay, so value 2/3. If B wins, then I get value negative 1/3. So I've ruled out two states. One of them is the correct one. Similarly, if C wins, by the way, this is all on the handout. Make sure you get it. It's on the chat if you got in late. Let's say I believe A or B will win. If A wins, I've got a true belief, but it's less informative, so I only get 1/3 rather than 2/3. So I've correctly ruled out one state of the world, namely the state in which C wins. If B wins, I also get 1/3, and if C wins, I get negative 2/3. I ruled out one state of the world, and it's the only one that was true. So I've let in two false states of the world. We can sort of think of that. So here the numbers are a natural measure of how much information a belief carries. Okay. So let's say that's our picture of belief. Let's say we want to identify the cognitive utility of my beliefs with their informativeness, as Levi does. Question: how should I aggregate? So I don't know what's going to happen. I just have some probabilities. Like right now, I think, okay, probability 0.5 A will win, 0.3 B will win, 0.2 C will win. what should I believe? Should I have an outright belief that A will win? Should I be agnostic? What should I do? So question, how should I aggregate the various values I might get, the various cognitive utilities I'll get in these different states of the world to get a single value for each possible belief that I might hold, where the total value corresponds to which belief I should adopt. So initial thought, let's just maximize expected cognitive utility given my probabilities. So the utility of believing that A will win is just the probability of A multiplied by the cognitive utility I get if A is true, plus the probability of that B is true multiplied by the cognitive utility I get from believing that A will win if B is true, and so forth. So that's the initial thought. However, we notice that some individuals are more cautious than others or require a higher evidential bar to believe. So Levi's idea here is that individuals can vary in how they value truth versus agnosticism relative to how they value agnosticism versus error. So for example, let's just take a single proposition, X. So my options are believe X, be agnostic, namely believe X or not X, or believe not X. What are the cognitive payoffs in the various states of the world? Well, if X is true and I believe it, I get 1. If not X is true and I believe X, I get 0. Vice versa, if I believe not X. But Levi says the value of agnosticism is going to be somewhere in the middle, and that's up to me. So for example, and that's the M here on the chart. So for example, let's say I set M equals 0.7. That means the value I have of being agnostic, no matter what the state of the world is 0.7. In other words, the difference between agnosticism and believing something false is higher than the difference between agnosticism and believing something true. So we might say that like believing more informative things has a diminishing marginal value. Okay. Again, however, I think there are actually 2 different phenomena here. Just as there were 2 different phenomena that could give rise to risk aversion, there are 2 different phenomena that could give rise to being cautious in my beliefs, to having good reason to be agnostic rather than to settle on a belief. And one reason is the one Levi points out, how much I like truth versus agnosticism and falsehood versus agnosticism once it's settled whether my belief is true or false. So how M relates to 0 and 1 here. But here's another phenomenon. How heavily I weight bad possibilities. So it might be that I think the difference between true belief and agnosticism, once things are settled, is just the same as the difference between agnosticism and a false belief. In both cases, I've like, I just have one extra bit of information, say, or have one extra, one more informative belief than I had in the previous level. However, I might still prefer to be agnostic because I weight worst case scenarios more heavily. So I might say, even though on average, being agnostic is just as good as believing X straight out, I want to take great pains to avoid the possibility in which I have a false belief, because I put more weight on bad possibilities than on good possibilities. So just like the person who likes each cup of coffee as much as the last cup, but still doesn't want to take the coin flip between 0 and 2 cups, thinks I'm going to pursue the strategy so that in the worst case scenario, I at least get something moderately good. So too, the agnostic says, I'm going to pursue the strategy that in the worst case scenario, or putting more weight on the worst case scenario, ensures that my beliefs are at least moderately successful. Okay, so this way of thinking about why agnosticism might be valuable gives rise to an alternative picture. Instead of maximizing expected cognitive utility, where the informational values are distorted by a function that diminishes marginally, we can maximize risk-weighted expected cognitive utility, where the utilities are just the bits of information, and we can give more weight to worse possibilities. So on this picture, everyone would set m equals 0.5, because m is just the measure of how much information that belief contains. But people would have different risk functions, where the risk function tells you how much to weight the good case in which you have the true belief rather than the false belief. So on both pictures, we can, for example, explain why somebody requires a threshold of like 0.7 to believe X. On the one, in the first picture, it's because they don't think truth is that much better than agnosticism. And in my picture, it's because they care more about worst case scenarios, scenarios in which their beliefs go pretty badly, than they do about the scenarios in which their beliefs happen to all be correct. Okay, so the key question to distinguish between the two strategies is going to be, do we require a certain evidential bar because truth isn't that much better than agnosticism? Or do we require a certain evidential bar because the possibility of being wrong gets more weight in our deliberation than better possibilities get? Again, part of my goal here is to convince you that there really are two options here. I think the second one is better, and happy to like debate about that, but like at the very least, I want us to think we've ignored this other possibility. We haven't even considered this other reason why we might like agnosticism or might require a certain evidential bar for believing something. Okay. So again, we had this phenomenon in which we didn't like things to be spread out. In this case, we didn't like the cognitive utility of our beliefs to be spread out. We didn't want to be in a scenario in which we could have gotten 0 or 1. We'd rather be in a scenario in which we get 0.5 for sure, or maybe opposite thing. I don't know. Maybe you'd rather be in the scenario in which you get 1 or 0 rather than 0.5. There were two ways to handle this. The standard one involves distorting the measure of the value, and mine involves distorting the weight that each value gets. Okay. Final phenomenon is social choice theory. So social choice theory concerns the evaluation of social distributions, where a social distribution is just an assignment of outcomes to individual people. Sometimes these are talked about in terms of well-being. Sometimes they're talked about in terms of the more general term utility. But the idea here is there are two ways our society could be for Anne and Bob and Cecil. On distribution 1, Anne gets 100 units of well-being, Bob gets 200, and Cecil gets 300. On distribution 2, they all get 200 units of well-being. Question, how should we go from the units of well-being that each individual gets to a single value for each social distribution so we can compare them and say which one is better? So this is the aggregation problem for social distributions. So an initial thought, and many of you might end up thinking this is the final thought. We can talk about that in Q&A if you want. But an initial thought is that we should maximize average utility or total utility. So again, and this is just going to be the same picture that we had for decision theory, but instead of these proportions being 1/3 of the states we have a third of the people. Okay. So if we take the initial thought that we should maximize average or total utility, then distribution 1 and distribution 2 have the same value. But many people think that the second distribution is better than this first distribution. In other words, many people are inequality averse or think we ought to be inequality averse. Excuse me. One strategy for handling inequality aversion is to just say that inequality is bad in itself. So it's to say that we should take some measure of the inequality of each distribution and subtract it from the total utility. I'm not going to talk about that strategy here, although I'm happy to talk about it in Q&A. It has analogs in the other cases, as it turns out. But let's set that aside. Let's say you're the kind of person that thinks inequality doesn't matter in itself. All the facts about all the facts about a value of the distribution come from how the distribution goes for individual people. A standard move that people make here is to adopt this view called prioritarianism. Prioritarianism says we should distort the values, the utilities, or the measure of well-being using a concave moral importance function. So again, here, these are the utility values, and then our moral importance values. We might have V of 100 equals 100, V of 200 equals 200, and V of 300 equals 270. So the more well-being somebody has, the less morally important their well-being is. So again, we bring this down so that the prioritarian is going to say the value is the area under the curve, and this distribution is going to have more area under the curve than this distribution does. Okay. So that's one of the standard views for taking inequality into account. But bet you can guess what I'm going to say next. There's in fact a different reason that we might think that more equal distributions are better, besides thinking inequality is bad in itself. On the one hand, we might think that the moral importance function, how much a bit of utility matters in the overall, how much a bit of utility for a person matters morally. We might think that function involves saturation. Once I get 100 units of well-being, the next 100 units of well-being are less morally important, for example. Or we might think that the interests of the worst off get more weight in the moral evaluation. So we might instead adopt a picture like I have here. So we might think the importance of a bit of well-being or a person's utility is just the size of that person's utility, but the weight that each group of individuals gets depends on where that group falls in the ordering. So you might think that bits of value or utility that go to everyone, they count, they're weighted with weight 1, but bits of utility that say only go to the top 2/3 of people, they get less weight. Maybe they get weight 4/9. And bits of utility that only go to the top 1/3 of people, I mean, they matter, but they matter proportionally less. They only get weight 1/9, for example. So this is a different way to take into account the fact that we don't like inequality. Again, so we sort of like shrink the weight that each group gets as the groups get better and better off. And this is going to tell us that, again, this distribution is better than this distribution because there's more weight under the curve. So I call this view relative prioritarianism. So the other view, the standard prioritarian view, we can call absolute prioritarianism. It says that how much value an individual's utility gets depends on how much utility that person already has. So it's a measure that doesn't depend at all on what other people have. On my view, relative prioritarianism, the weight of your interests depends on whether you're the worst off person or the best off person or somewhere in the middle. So the weight that your utility values get is going to be relative to where you are in the ordering. We should put more weight on the interests of worse off people and less weight on the interests of better off people. And you can see how this is just sort of exactly parallel to risk-weighted expected utility. As I was talking about the earlier problem, I mentioned that I might put more or less weight on how things go for like the best off 1/3 of future Laras. Taking a gamble is like facing a distribution problem among my future possible selves. Here we're talking about the actual distribution problem among people, and I think the two should be thought of in a parallel way. When I'm thinking about the decision theory problem, I have to decide how much do I value worse off future possible Laras against better off future possible Laras. And when I'm thinking about the standard distribution problem, I should think about how much should I value the worst off individuals versus the relatively better off individuals. And if we think inequality, and if we think unequal distributions with the same mean value are worse than equal distributions with the same mean value, that is because I claim we think we should give more weight to the interests of the worst off. So again, if we don't like unequal distributions, there are two strategies we can take. We can say, actually, the thing we said we cared about, well-being, that's not the thing we actually care about. We care about something more complex, a diminishing marginal function of well-being. Or we can say, we should give more weight to the interests of the worse off. We just care about well-being, but the well-being of the relatively worse off matters more than the well-being of the relatively better off. Okay, so those are the three domains in which it turns out we want to capture the phenomenon of being averse to spread. There's the standard way to do it, distort the value we thought we cared about, but still take an expectation. And then there's the way I argue for, which is we still care about the value we thought we cared about, but take a weighted expectation with more weight on the worse off or lower down instances of the value. And just so you just to like, so you don't think this is merely a matter of like notation. Oh, you can sort of like draw the graph either way, but you know, you get the same rankings out. I want to just illustrate the difference between the two. So I'm going to bring up a paradox in each domain. It's the paradox that was first identified in decision theory, but we can identify an analog of it in every domain. Well, let me explain it and then I'll tell you what it shows. Okay. How many people have seen the Allais paradox in decision theory before? Probably most of you, very many of you, but I'll just go through it anyway in case someone hasn't. Okay. So first, let's say I offer you a 10, you can have L1 or L2. L1 is a 10% chance of $5 million and L2 is an 11% chance of $1 million. So just show of hands or thumbs up on your little screen. How many people would rather have L1, the 10% chance of $5 million? All right. How many of you would rather have L2, the 11% chance of $1 million? Not so many. Okay. Now, second pair, you can have L3 or L4. L3 is an 89% chance of $1 million, a 10% chance of $5 million, and a 1% chance of nothing. L4 is a 100% chance of $1 million. All right, so how many people would rather have L3? All right, Nevin, going against the grain. How many people would rather have L4? Most people. All right, so these are, as you probably all know, these are the standard preferences. L1 is preferred to L2, L4 is preferred to L3. There's no utility function of money that captures both preferences. Why? Because these preferences are not about how much you like various amounts of money. They're not about getting saturated in money. Instead, they come from the idea that you care a lot about the worst case scenario. So L1 and L2 have like the same worst case scenario, nothing with almost the same chance. So you think, well, gosh, I'd rather have like the chance of much more money, 5 million, than a slightly higher chance of less money, 1 million. But when you compare L3 and L4, L4 just has a much higher minimum, and that fact completely swamps your preference. So those are your reasons for having these preferences. Then distorting the utility function is not going to be able to capture them, because they have to do with putting more emphasis on relative position. In this case, putting more emphasis on worst case scenarios. All right, well, we can define a version of this paradox both for the epistemology case and for the social choice case. If in each domain we have the L1 over L2 and L4 over L3 preference, then this strategy of taking a diminishing marginal function of something is not going to capture the thing we care about. So here's the cognitive utility version, and I'm sort of using more like rough rather than precise characterizations of epistemic states here. So consider L1 versus L2. L1 is a 10% chance of highly informative truth and a 90% chance of error. L2 is an 11% chance of moderately informative truth and an 89% chance of error. So just thinking about your beliefs, how many people would rather have L1 than L2? All right, how many people would rather have L2? All right, great. You guys have what are the preferences I hoped you'd have. All right, L3 versus L4. L3 is an 89% chance of moderately informative truth, a 10% chance of highly informative truth, and a 1% chance of error. L4 is a 100% chance of moderately informative truth. All right, how many prefer L3? How many prefer L4? All right, so you guys had the standard preferences. If you're right that L1 is more valuable than L2 and L4 is more valuable than L3, then we can't use the Levi strategy to capture what you care about. Again, it's because you care about what goes on in the worst case. You weight what goes on in the worst case more heavily. L4 just has this like really excellent worst case, moderately informative truth, and that swamps whatever happens in L3. All right, here's the social choice version of the Allais paradox. So again, L1 versus L2. In L1, 10% of the population gets $5 million or 5 million well-being units. 90% of the population gets 50,000. I've given them more than 0 just because 0 is like not a lot of money to have. L2, 11% chance the population gets 1 million. 89% of the population gets 50,000. How many people think L1 is better than L2? How many people think L2 is better than L1? All right, maybe like a little bit less certainty about this, but all right, let me just mention L3 versus L4. In L3, 89% of the population gets $1 million or units of well-being, 10% gets $5 million or units of well-being, and 1% gets $50,000 or units of well-being. In L4, everyone gets $1 million or units of well-being. How many people think L3 is better? How many think L4 is better? Okay, so again, if we had a ranking, we had the standard Allais ranking. Again, in all these examples, the precise values don't matter. If we have something of this form, then the standard way of capturing it is not going to work. So it looks like, at least with this crowd in these examples, you're pretty on board with the values that cannot be captured by the standard view. And again, why is this? Well, the standard view is about saturation. It says, once our population gets 1 million units of well-being, say, there's not a big moral difference in them getting 5 million units of well-being, whereas the preferences actually didn't come from saturation. They came from caring more about the relatively worst off person or group of people here. Okay. So in addition to sort of there being examples to separate the two types of views, there are principles that separate them. So we can talk about them in terms of which principle we should obey. So the separability principle says that if two, depending on which domain we're talking about, gambles, beliefs, or distributions, agree on what happens in one part of them, so in some event or to some person, then we can ignore what happens in that event or person when evaluating which gamble is preferred. And this is versions of this in the different domains are called the sure thing principle in decision theory, or the subgroup separability principle in social choice theory. So that's one principle. Here's a different kind of principle called the invariance principle. The invariance principle says that the value difference that A makes to a consequence is the same whether or not that consequence contains B. So A and B here could be bits of money. So the value that some bit of money, or they could be bits of well-being, the value that some bit of money or well-being makes to a consequence is the same whether or not that consequence contains some other value of money, or the value that a bit of information, say whether A is true or false, makes to a consequence is the same whether or not that consequence also contains like a correct belief with respect to B. Okay, so the standard strategy says that we have to obey the separability principle. It says, so if we obey the separability principle, my view is ruled out. My view says, don't obey the separability principle. All parts of a distribution matter to what happens because we have to figure out what the relatively worst event is, and that relies on what goes on in the rest of the gamble. On the other hand, the invariance principle rules out the standard strategy. So if, for example, we think that one bit of well-being is just as valuable as the last, or one bit of information is just as valuable as the last, then we're not going to be able to use the standard strategy. We rule out having a diminishing marginal function of the thing that we care about. Of course, you might think neither principle is good, and you might think we have to have a hybrid view in one or more of these domains. That's what I think in the case of decision theory. I think you can have a diminishing marginal utility function of money and also have give more weight to worst case scenarios. Okay. So we only have a few minutes left. Let me just explain. So I've explained the difference between the two strategies. Here's why the difference matters. The upshots of the different views are going to be different. So let me just mention two upshots. In the case of decision theory, if you adopt the standard strategy, then information is always going to be neutral or good. And if you adopt my strategy, new information can sometimes put you in a worse decision-making principle. So for that reason, it's important to know which strategy is the correct one, because we want to know, should we assume that information is like always good, or should we think maybe sometimes it's not? Here's another reason the difference matters in the case of social choice theory. Consider the different arguments people might make against inequality, or against, say, caring for the poor. you might cite some fact that's meant to shock. Like you might say, wow, the best off person in the US has like 10,000 times the salary of the worst off person in the US, or something like that. Somebody might, and then you might say, like, let's do something about that. Let's make sure worse off people are better off. Somebody might come up with the rejoinder, well, inequality isn't bad. So I don't have to do anything about that. They might be correct. They might be correct that inequality in itself isn't bad. But we want to be able to show then that there still are reasons to care about the relatively worse off person, even if inequality itself isn't that bad. So my kind of view, I mean, both prioritarian views provide a reason to say that, but they're different kinds of reasons. So we want to know like what the true reason is so that we can convincingly state why is it that we should care about people who are not well off. Okay. General, and let me just step back a bit to talk about the general point, which is that there are like two very different dimensions in aggregation problems that we have to consider. And in all these standard views, they've been like collapsed into one, or it's been thought that these are just the same thing. But as it turns out, they're really different. So let me just talk about the difference between what I call assessment and what I call weight. So assessment is going to correspond to at each particular location, what value do you assign to the thing you care about? And weight is going to correspond to how much do you value each particular location? How much does each location count in determining the overall value? So here's an example in which everyone agrees about the weight but disagrees about the assessment. So an Olympic committee wants to determine how to calculate a gymnast's overall score based on her score for 4 events. The committee agrees that the lowest score should be thrown out and the remaining scores should be averaged. So the committee agrees about the weight of each score, but one member thinks that gymnastics ability should be measured by execution, and another thinks that gymnastics ability should be measured by execution plus difficulty. So here, the committee disagrees about the assessment, but agrees about the weight. On the other hand, let's say 2 engineers agree about how to measure the strength of a single link of a chain. So they agree about the assessment. Excuse me. One engineer hypothesizes that the overall strength of a chain is the average of its links. The other hypothesizes that the overall strength of a chain is the strength of its weakest link. So here they disagree about weight. And so as I've been trying to argue, in these 3 domains in which we don't like spread, the standard view is that this is a matter of assessment, but a different, and I think better, answer is available. This is a matter of weight. And so in general, just to sort of belabor the point, we have in all 3 domains, we have objects often with a natural measure and bearers in particular proportions. What we want is a value function of objects, a function that assesses each object, and an aggregation function that takes sets of objects, bearers, and proportions to a single value, to a function. What we want is a function that determines how much weight each object gets. In decision theory, objects are consequences, sometimes measured by money. Bearers are events, and proportions are probabilities. In epistemology, objects are beliefs in states of the world, measured by the amount of true or false information they carry. Bearers are events, and proportions are subjective probabilities. In social choice theory, objects are outcomes measured by utilities. Bearers are groups of individuals, and proportions are proportions of the population. So in all 3 domains, if we're averse to spread, then our evaluations cannot be captured by both assessing each object by its natural measure and weighting each object in proportion to its natural proportion. The standard response is to hold that the value we care about is not equal to the natural measure. My response has been to hold that the weight that each proportion of the objects gets is not equal to the proportion they represent. Instead, objects that are like lower down in some sense get more weight. Okay, so the key philosophical question again is going to be, should we distort the values or distort the proportions or both? Distorting the values means that we think the magnitude of the value we want realized isn't proportional to the magnitude of its natural measure. So the magnitude of cognitive utility isn't proportional to how much information a belief carries, for example. Distorting proportions means that we think the weight we give to a particular realization of the value isn't proportional to its natural proportion. In each of these cases, it's been assumed that spread aversion should be captured by distorting the values, but that might not actually capture why we are, or all the ways in which we are, averse to spread. Okay, I'm not going to talk more about the place of formalism in philosophy. Happy to talk more about that in Q&A. I've already run over my time. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and I really look forward to your questions. And I see a cute baby.
All right, let's go ahead and get started again. So we now have until 11 o'clock Melbourne time, so about 50 minutes for Q&A. The first question is from Steve Finley.
Thank you. I was still trying to write down my question, so I'm not sure if I have all my thoughts in order. But yeah, that was fascinating. This is a bit of a meta-ethicist question, so I want to push back a little bit and resist the complication of the standard picture that you want. In particular, skeptical about the distinction between values and weights. So, I mean, take the basic decision theory case, your very simple-minded decision theory. It says, oh, look, you have non-linear patterns of people's preferences, and then there's standard responses to say, classically, but money and utility are not the same things. And then your move is to say, as I take it, in part to say, well, utility and risk-weighted utility are not the same things, right? But I guess I'm not totally convinced that you might not ultimately be making the same mistake that the person who just equates utility with money is making. And so partly, I mean, as a meta-ethicist, I struggle with the idea that weight and value are two different things. And so I wonder whether that depends on over-objectifying the notion of value to take value to be something in the world to which we can have different orientations towards, rather than, as someone more subjectivist might think, that value is essentially something about our orientation towards the world. So just to give you, so here's a couple of illustrations of how one might try to push back for a simpler picture, which just has something like probabilities and something like utilities. Right. I mean, in the moral case, right, you're talking about what morally matters, and you're contrasting that with individual people's interests. And then the response is, well, what we're interested in here is moral value. That just reduces to moral weight. And yes, it's different than individual people's utility. In the case of the decision theory case, you say, if you are concerned about risk, then risk is entering into your value function. Here's one way it could be doing so. One thing that you value is sort of your peace of mind, your states of sort of anticipation, and so if you are someone who is risk averse with respect to money, then that may simply be because you you really put a lot of value on peace of mind. Okay, I'll stop there. I'm sure you've heard challenges like this many times before.
Good. Yeah, thanks so much. There's several great questions in there. Let me kind of take them in reverse order. And so first is and one thing I actually want to say overall that I want to stress is that the view that we should take the average either in the decision theory or in social choice theory, that's not like a default view. Like that itself is a substantive view about what's valuable. So I just want to make sure that we don't take for granted that like, well, that's a given and now what else matters. But just so this is, I just mentioned that because it's probably going to pervade my responses to each of your worries. So let's start with the idea that maybe the right way to take risk into account is in the utility function itself. Well, and this is like a standard thing people say in the case of the Allais paradox, for example. It's not that I care about that minimum value 0, or it's not that I care so much about the fact that L4 has a higher minimum than L3. It's that like, oh, that 1% chance of 0. Gosh, if I ended up with 0, I would feel so much regret. And I just like hate regret. So regret itself has a certain amount of disutility. In response to that kind of worry, that kind of response, and also the sort of more general, what if I like anticipating the good, et cetera, I think if we look at it, while you might place some disvalue on regret, and that might go into your utility function, it can't do nearly the work we want it to do. In order for regret to flip the ordering of L1 and L2 to what it is in L3 versus L4, it ends up having to be worth something like $900,000. It's like, in other words, regret is so bad that you would pay $900,000 to avoid it. Or you pay $900,000, you'd forego $900,000 rather than having that regret. And I think that's just like wildly implausible. We could also try to sort of like come up with a case in which those psychological features can't play a role. For example, we might say, what if you're going to make this decision and then immediately have your memory wiped that you were ever involved in this decision? Or what if I'm going to be making this decision for Nevin, and Nevin's never going to know like what happened. He's just going to get some amounts of money or not. I think that's not going to flip our preferences. And I think that's just another indication that the thing that matters here isn't the outcome, rather it's that the thing that's my preference is tracking here isn't like some value that's realized in some particular outcome. It's rather the way the outcomes come together to give me the value for the entire gamble. In particular, it's how things go in the worst case mattering more to me than how things go in better cases. So that's my reply there to trying to take this into account in the value function itself. But you had this other more general way to put the question that I want to address, and the way you put it is maybe weight and value are the same thing. On a subjectivist view, for example, how can we, it's not like there's these like values in the world and there are these things that are weights. Like how can we, maybe it's all just a function of how we evaluate stuff. I think that could be right. I've been talking as if these things are given, as if we have, utilities, and we have well-being and that stuff's already in the world, and then we're talking about how to aggregate it. But in fact, that's not really the standard way that decision theorists talk. In general, decision theory sort of like arose during behaviorism, when it'd be like very, very spooky to talk about beliefs or desires or anything that you couldn't see out in the world. And so the sort of key thing in decision theory are these things called representation theorems, where it's like just a set of axioms, and if we satisfy them, then we can be represented as having a utility and probability function, or in the case of my view, as a utility, probability, and risk function. So we actually can distinguish the idea of weights and values at the level of preferences, because we can just say, so take the case of social choice theory, you can just tell me, here are my rankings of various distributions. I think this Alice, Bob, Cecil distribution is better than this one, and better than et cetera, et cetera. If you give me my ranking, I can tell you what your weights and values are. In particular, I can tell you what your weights and your utility function is. I actually think this is an advantage of my view over the standard prioritarian view, because the standard prioritarian view actually can't separate itself from utilitarianism in terms of how it ranks gambles. So for every prioritarian ranking of a gamble, there's going to be an equivalent utilitarian ranking of those gambles. You just have to say, actually, the thing you're calling moral value prioritarian, I'm calling well-being or utility. That actually doesn't happen on my picture, because we do have proportions given. Like, I hope you can at least grant there's a fact that like there are 3 people in the world. And so my picture will be able to separate, we'll be able to separately tell you, hey, Alice gets 100 utility from this state of the world, from when Alice is the worst off person, we give her interest weight, 50% or whatever it is. So while I was talking in this objectivist way, I just think it's an advantage if we don't have to talk about things in that way. Even if we think there are real values in the world, they're really, really hard to measure. Like, what's the utility you get from eating an apple? Like, I have no idea. The thing I can measure is like, you think this ranking is better than this ranking, great. So yeah, again, I think it's an advantage of separating weights. It's an advantage of distorting the weights rather than the values, that we can, that we don't have to think the values are like objectively in the world, or we don't have to have independent access to them, because distorting the proportions means I just have to have access to what proportion of people have which thing, whereas distorting the values, in order to make sense of that, you have to have access to the values. The prioritarian has to say, oh, here's like this separate place that I get utility from, and it can't be rankings. So I have utility, and then from rankings I get moral value. Anyway, so you get the point. But feel free to follow up.
Thank you.
Caleb Pearl is next.
Cool. So I wanted to ask about the way that this stuff plays with Elizabeth Anderson's stuff on what's wrong with inequality, because it's not totally clear to me how it does play with it. So the thing I'm thinking of is, she's thinking like the thing that's objectionable about inequality is that it threatens to create hierarchies and relations of domination and that sort of thing. And it's not totally clear to me how we can get your two distinctions going if we have that picture of what's wrong with inequality. So just to give you the flavor of the sort of thing, like suppose I'm choosing between one button that creates severe scarcity of resources but doesn't change anything in relations of domination. and another button that reduces relations of domination but leaves the material resources the same. And suppose that the worse off are actually, in fact, worse off in the first case where material resources are reduced. Still, the Anderson sort of picture is going to say, like, the thing I think it's going to say, the sort of thing that it makes sense to do is to choose the second option, even though it leaves the worse off than they'd be under the other option. Nonetheless, it's reducing the relations of domination and hierarchy. Um, so, so that seems to me like a really powerful picture of the thing that's objectionable about inequality. And it's not clear to me that we get your two distinctions going if that's the way that we're thinking about what's objectionable about inequality. Like, it seems to me like if we're thinking on that picture what to do under uncertainty, the thing to do is just minimize expected hierarchy and domination. And so it doesn't seem to me like there's space to worry about distorting the two things that you're interested in distorting. So I guess the more general question is, if we have this sort of Anderson style picture about what's wrong with inequality, do you think we do get your two different strategies going?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thanks so much. So there, I don't want to say there's necessarily just one thing wrong with inequality, just like there might be multiple ways to care about risk. So someone, for example, might have the attitude Steve mentioned where they really like anticipating the good. They might not like risk for that reason, and they also might not like risk for my reason. There's just two separate reasons that are both compatible. I would say a similar thing here to the Anderson point. So I've been just assuming that utility, the thing we aggregate in social choice theory, is well-being, but that's really just a placeholder. I didn't give you any view about where my well-being comes from. The way I would fit the Anderson view into this picture is to say that that's a view about where individual well-being comes from. So my well-being doesn't need to just depend on facts about me. I mean, one thing that influences my well-being is how many friends I have, who I hung out with yesterday. So well-being isn't just this sort of it could be this really complicated thing. Importantly for me, once we determine what someone's well-being is in a given scenario, maybe that involves relations of domination and how strong they are and so forth, we still have to answer the question of how to aggregate. So it's still going to be a live question, even once you tell me that being in the bottom end of a relation of domination is really bad for me, even if I have abundant resources. In fact, maybe I'm better off than the person who has scarce resources, but is at the top of a relation of domination. Once you tell me those things, I still have to answer the question, okay, if Anne is in this situation with respect to resources and domination, Bob is in this situation, and Cecil is in this situation, how do we take the facts about each of the three of them to arrive at a single value for how they're doing? And again, one answer is utilitarianism. I think people treat that as the default answer, oh, we want to put values together, so we average them unless we want to do something else too. But again, I want to say that it's like a substantive question, what we should do. And on my view, we should care more about the interests of the worst off. So you could think both kinds of inequality matter, or inequality matters in both ways. You could think that relations of domination are one thing that make my life bad. But in addition, we should rather have three people have a moderately good life than one person have a bad life, one person have a medium life, and one person have a good life, independently of how the relations of domination gave rise to good, bad, and medium. Yeah, I do think that's a powerful view, and so yeah, and I'm very happy to adopt it.
Clayton Littlejohn is next.
Hi, Clayton.
Laura, hey, thanks. That was great. That was a great presentation. I felt like I learned a lot about a lot of things. I feel like this question is not so much about getting you to defend sort of your approach to epistemic utility theory, or at least like the one sketched in the paper, but just sort of curious about how you develop it. It seemed like in the presentation, again, this might just be an artifact of the presentation, you have what I would call a pretty chilled out attitude towards people's taste for risk. I mean, you didn't come in and say like, oh, you know, James is. Still, sorry, am I still there? Sorry, just a call failed.
No.
Okay, you know, I mean, like, I didn't hear, you know, you signing up for this idea that like James's cute mountain climbing examples aside, we should all be risk averse. And I feel like I have a friend who's an epistemic risk seeker. He seems to suffer from like epistemic FOMO. He seems to really be averse to the idea that he doesn't have an opinion about something. So we'll call this person David. So, you know, David has like opinions about how many colors there are and things like that. And it makes for great dinner conversation. So one of the things I'm sort of curious about is in the framework you've described, if you have someone who's an epistemic risk seeker, there are some constraints on rational belief that are kind of harder to vindicate without putting constraints in other parts of the theory. So, you know, rational belief requires that it's more likely than not that you're right. Is a kind of hard one to like, I've been trying to do the, you know, get the story straight on that. And then similarly, like consistency constraints. You know, so if I present David with these questions, you know, if he's allowed to believe P as opposed to being agnostic when P is not more likely than not, you know, he might also be allowed to believe not P when that's not more likely than not. And then it's kind of like, why would it be wrong for him to take both sides of that? Yeah, so I was just sort of curious, you know, do you think the right responses to this is to say there are rational constraints on people's taste for risk, or, you know, do the constraints come from other parts of the theory in your view?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So let me back up and tell you a little bit more about Levi's picture. And then that'll help us figure out, should we in particular not allow people to be risk seeking? Because yeah, I'm on board with various levels of risk aversion. I think I'm on the fence about whether to allow risk seeking in the case of beliefs. So importantly, Levi doesn't allow it. And here's how. He doesn't allow risk seeking in the diminishing marginal utility sense. So on page 3 of the handout, we have this M that measures agnosticism. He requires it to be greater than 0.5. So that, and his reason for doing that is, if I recall correctly, is similar to the thing you just mentioned. Like, he doesn't want it to be the case that believing X and believing not X are both better options than agnosticism. That starts to look like a little weird. Is that really weird? I mean, I guess I could see your friend saying, no, that's not weird. I could see your friend saying, and maybe William James himself saying, like, no, the worst thing to do is to not stake a claim. You know, I want to have the truth or die trying. I want to go out in flames, like none of this like wishy-washy in the middle stuff. So that's, you know, that's why I'm torn. I will say kind of 2 more things, because the particular constraints that you mentioned is both the requirement that you're at least more likely right than not, and consistency constraints. So just to say a little bit about Levi's picture. for Levi, you're actually evaluating holistic belief states. So you're not separately comparing like, oh, let me think about X, yes or no, let me think about not X, yes or no. What you're in fact doing is you're taking all the atoms, so like in the case of the election, A, B, and C are the atoms, and then you're laying out all the distinct possibilities, A, B, C, A or B, A or C, et cetera, et cetera. And then you're saying which gets the highest cognitive utility. So this expected cognitive utility. So this is why his picture is different from like a Lockean picture. Because otherwise, as you can sort of see just from my one example, they look like very similar, right? So for him, the consistency constraints are built in. So if we adopt that same picture, then we wouldn't have to separately worry about that. So we wouldn't be able to rule out the risk-seeking case in that way. And then this idea that you have to be 50% sure that you're right. I mean, you might have thought about this more than I have. One bit of Levi's picture that I actually find attractive is that it can explain why you might adopt a belief, even if that belief itself is less than 50% true. And the answer is because that's a very informative belief. So it might be, for example, that the belief that candidate A will win is only like 45%, but nonetheless, it gets a higher expected utility than these like more wishy-washy beliefs. And in that case, that's not the same as thinking that both X and not X are higher than agnosticism. In this case, it's because you're certain enough about A that it does better than the disjunctions it might be coupled with. I mean, you might need a lot of beliefs for that to be true. You might need like A, B, C, D, E or something like that. I'm a little bit not recalling, but yeah, so those constraints actually aren't part of the picture here. Maybe for you, that's a mark against the picture. But I think independently of those facts, I'm torn about whether to allow risk-seekingness for the exact reason I mentioned. The con, it lets you think agnosticism is worse than everything else. Pro, it lets you think agnosticism is worse than everything else.
Cool. Thanks. I felt like that was amazing. I just learned quite a lot about the new stuff, and that was great. Thanks for that.
So much.
James Cohn is up next.
Thank you for the presentation. It's likely to show that I'm not trained as a philosopher. Turing wrote one of the first papers attempting to mathematicize microeconomics, and it involved a claim that 2 half chances of different cars were as good as 1 car, which struck me as just frankly implausible. Thank you for giving me some account of that. And I have 3 other things. Gambling against somebody with strangely composed non-transitive dice. For every die that somebody commits to, there's another die that wins against it more often than not, which makes comparing the dice not an aggregation problem. I wonder how your approach speaks to other not an aggregation problems.
Sorry, can you say that example again? The connection's a little bit weak, I think.
Now I'm going to check that I'm using the right microphone. I need audio settings in Zoom, and I'm seeing activity, and I think I'm using the best available microphone, and I will get closer to it.
Okay, no, good. Yeah. If you could just say the example a little slower.
There are 3 dice.
Okay.
Each, and these are called non-monotonic dice.
Okay.
And all of them have numbers on them.
Okay.
But they're not the standard set.
Okay.
and for each of the 3 dice, one of the other dice wins against it, comparing numbers round by round, and the other one loses. So
Okay.
there's no statistic that compares one die to another die.
Okay. And is that it? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So this is where you've got to so far. How does it speak to problems that are not aggregatable in this way?
So am I correct in thinking that the dice on these dice, we can't assign probabilities to outcomes? No, that's not right. No, right. It's just that, so you can assign probabilities. It's just that dice A has a higher probability. No, sorry. Yeah. Can you re-describe in terms of probabilities? That would be okay.
You can't assign a value that predicts probabilities that one die produces a greater number than another, because it depends on which die it's being compared to.
But can you assign probabilities to like the overall value that results from each die?
If you're averaging the values across all of the rolls, yes. To get the behavior, you need to be comparing throw by throw. And somebody wins and somebody loses, and all of the wins and losses have the same value.
Okay. And the question is which of the 3 dice I should pick, or the question is like when I'm going up against an opponent, or just in general to get the highest value. Okay. But that depends on what my opponent picks, right? So are we now in the realm of game theory, not in the realm of decision theory, or?
Probably, yes.
Okay. Good. So I'm sort of just starting to work on the application of my view and decision theory here to game theory, but in general, you're just going to take the thing that was expected value in game theory and replace it by risk-weighted expected value. So insofar, I think it sounds, if I understand the problem correctly, it sounds like the game theoretic solution is to be there's only one equilibrium. It's the mixed equilibrium between all 3 dice. Both of us play that.
Okay, it's going to show that I'm not enough of a game theorist.
Okay. So yeah, if I understand the question, that's just like a game of rock, paper, scissors. Basically, you have like one dice, like rocks better than paper, or I don't know, the other way around. But so you have like a pairwise thing, a cycle where you have 3 things. In each case, one beats the other. Which should you pick? In like standard game theory with expected utility, the only equilibria, so the only states in which, given what my opponent picks, and what I pick, neither of us would do better by switching, are what's called mixed equilibrium, in which we just have, we just like randomly select which thing to play. And that same thing is going to happen here. But it is like a complicated question. What if this is your view of individual decision making? How does that apply to games with more than one person? So that's like a really great subject to bring up, and also a very complicated one. I'm actually like working on some simulations involving those questions right now.
Just to interject, I think the case is like rock, paper, scissors, but with probabilities rather than certainty for beating. So it's like, it's like if rock has a 2/3 chance of beating scissors and paper has a 2/3 chance of beating rock, and so on. That's the structure of the example.
Good. Yeah, I don't think that should change is that right? That it shouldn't change I
don't think it changes the optimal strategy. I think that's right.
Yeah, that's an interesting case to think about. Thank you very much, James.
welcome. Next one, I've come across satisficing just a little bit.
Uh-huh.
Thinking about the cost to acquire more information versus the value that it will have on the outcome in the standard prioritarian account. I'm wondering if there's a relative prioritarian account of satisficing and whether it would give different advice.
That's a great question. So I guess there's an analog of satisficing. So in the case of the sort of standard view of satisficing is like after a certain utility value, the possibility of additional utility shouldn't be taken into account at all, which is to say your utility function is just flat after a certain value. I guess.
Well, it's relative utility between the cost to acquire the information and the value of acquiring it in the standard prioritarian account.
Okay, yeah, that's a slightly different, right? So that can just be explained as a standard case of maximizing expected utility, where the expected utility you could get is outweighed by just the negative expected utility of information, basically. Okay. So there's a similar thing here. In fact, as I think I mentioned in my presentation just briefly, there's in standard expected utility, you like cost-free information, or at least you don't dislike it. Whereas on my view, you sometimes can dislike even cost-free information. And the reason for that is because it can basically like keep you from taking what was going to be a good risk. This is like the downsides of the upside of new information is like it could make you make a better choice. The downside is it could make you make a worse choice. And the risk of that weighs more heavily. It can, depending on your probabilities, weigh more heavily for me. So that might be a different way to think about a phenomenon that's similar to satisficing, is like stop looking for new information, not because of its sort of physical cost in terms of like, mentally acquiring it, but in terms of stop looking for more information because it might stray your hand away from the good course of action.
Okay, so I'm attempting to cash that out as the standard account tells me to sort the acquired information in order of cost. And your account could be telling me to sort the acquired information in order of quality.
Sure. Or in terms of, risk, and quality is going to enter into it, because the specific situations in which you shouldn't look for more information is in which you already have a high chance that the risk you're taking will pay off, but the new information is like, could put you into this state in which you're just like not sure one way or another. It's like not well correlated with the truth of the thing. So yeah, that is low quality information, I think, is a good way to put that. So I like your little gloss on that. Yeah.
So it could increase the spread of the outcomes if it's bad information.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think I want to make sure we get through the queue. So with apologies, I'm gonna cut you off.
Okay, I'll duck out. If you get to the end of the queue, I could be interested.
I'm happy to put you back in at the end. So next is John Haldane.
Hi, John. Oh, I think you're muted.
You're muted, John.
I'm okay, that's fine. Sorry about that. Yeah, hi Lara. That was extremely interesting, may I say, and very rich. And I liked the drawing of the parallels across the three classes of cases and the ambition of a common solution. Maybe I could just, maybe along the way I kind of slightly lost the point of this, or wasn't sure of keeping track of the point of this. So, and partly this relates to when you introduced or made reference to the Allais paradox. So I suppose one question would be something like this. Is the project here a kind of explanatory one, I suppose? And that would be, analogous to, say, responding to the Allais paradox in terms of a kind of descriptive adequacy. You might say that, you know, people's preferences, orders of preferences, don't seem to correspond, let's say, to expected utility. And now we have to sort of tinker around and see what else might be going on to get a descriptively adequate account. Or we might want to say that this is a kind of, we might have a normative response, just say that expected utility doesn't give us a good account of practical rationality or something of that sort. And I just wasn't sure. So when you've got these two options, which in each of the cases, basically it comes down, if I get it right, to we can either, as it were, change or distort or modify the interpretation of the values that are being aggregated here, or we can change the weighting. And those seem to be the two options. I'm just not clear, is that meant to be, as it were, as part of an explanation of why one might have one ordering or another ordering, or is it part of a sort of normative claim that, and maybe this just more needs to be said about this. So, for example, you know, this seminar is being given under the auspices of Australian Catholic University. So Catholic social teaching has as one of its component elements the idea of the option for the poor. Mm-hmm. So it might say something like this: in the distribution of welfare or other goods across a society, you should give preference to the worst off. Now, you might think of it as maximin, or you might think of it in other ways. Now, on one view, this might be a matter of a principle of justice. Right? You might just say that what we should have are pattern distributions in which and here we are actually looking at the overall pattern distributions in which the situation of the worst off should be prioritized in certain ways. But somebody might say, no, actually, this isn't a question of justice, because in fact, if you apply plausible principles of justice, it might not give you that result. Actually, the option for the poor is, say, a principle of charity. It's not a principle of justice. I don't mean charity in the sort of sentimental sense of that. I mean, for caritas, it's a duty, but it's a duty of care or love, not a duty of justice. That sort. Now, there we've clearly gone into the normative domain. I mean, we could, of course, re-express it descriptively, because you might try to say that, well, some people's preference in these cases for certain aggregations are to be explained in terms of their attachment to a principle of justice, or I would suggest in this case a principle of care. And so that's a case of changing the weightings, right? Rather than, as it were, distorting the values. You might hold the value of value might just be, as you say, more generally characterized as utility or something of that sort. So I suppose my question really is this: is this a sort of prolegomena to a normative theory, or is it an attempt just to give a kind of descriptively adequate or possible alternative explanations of people's actually expressed preference, as opposed to what, let's say, a general theory of, you know, expected utility might predict or something? So that's basically what I'm asking, I suppose.
Yeah, great. Great question. Thanks so much. And I really like the way that you outlined the option for the poor as well. So this is definitely the prolegomena to a normative view in all three domains. But I'll tell you how the sort of descriptive bit with the Allais paradox fits in. I think that when we notice that a theory isn't capturing some data about what we actually do or what we actually think is right, then we have to take a closer look at the theory. So the data itself it's not that we need to capture the Allais paradox. It's that if we have those preferences, then we need to look at the specific part of the theory that gets them wrong, see if there's another option that gets them right, and then compare the two theories normatively. So that's sort of exactly why it's a prolegomena. So, hey, we have these preferences, standard theory doesn't capture them, this theory does. This should make us take a look at the new theory, and now we can debate about which theory is correct. And so then it's just sort of like a separate project in all three domains to argue that the theory I've given is correct. So the book was sort of the arguing that this is the correct theory in the case of decision theory. And then I have just two kind of more recent papers arguing that it's the social choice theory view is the correct view. And some of it just relies on sort of argument. Some of it does rely on, we all have this strong, like, normative intuition that this distribution is better than this one. But many people also think that, like, just making things equal doesn't make things better. So there is a sort of argument from our beliefs or preferences, but those beliefs are sort of supposed to be our considered moral beliefs, rather than just like, hey, I would like it if the poor had some stuff. Maybe you wouldn't like it, but I would, or something like that. So that's the sort of two roles of the empirical bit about our own preferences. The first role is just to make us look more closely, see if there is another option, and then compare the options using philosophical argument. The second use is, in some cases, we take our beliefs to themselves to be normative, or people have argued like for the beliefs themselves, and then we directly want to get a theory that captures them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sam Carter.
Cool, thanks a lot. So I was thinking about the kind of epistemic cases, and I was thinking they were like, setting aside just like arbitrarily setting the value of M as a way to kind of model caution, there are kind of two ways that I think of caution in the epistemic case as sort of giving rise to the same preferences, right? So you could think, oh, one thing we could do is transform our probability function, but another thing we could do, if we're thinking of informativeness as just the number of answers you're ruling out, you could also transform the value of informativeness, right? So you place more value on ruling out more answers or less, right? And it seems like you can use those to give rise to the same preferences. And then I was wondering, do you think as long as we allow for risk aversion, we don't need to think about another sort of transformation on the informativeness value? Again, are you thinking we can model everything you could do by transforming your informativeness value function? You're transforming the measuring of informativeness using risk aversion? Or are you thinking, oh no, we should allow for both of these things? There are actually kind of two ways of being cautious in the epistemic case: there's being risk averse, and then there's also being like, there's how much you value information.
No, I want to say that's a great question. I want to just say, instead of transforming how much we value informativeness, we should just transform the weight. I think we can get, we get different stuff, but I think we get all this stuff with that case. So this is actually a way in which the epistemology case and the social choice case are different from the decision theory case. In the decision theory case, I think we should both transform money by the utility function. You might in fact, most people do, like, value money less as you get more of it, and we should transform the weights. In the case of both the epistemology and the social choice theory case, I think we should just transform the weight. So I think the value of beliefs are their informativeness. I think the moral way, as I was sort of saying in my response to the first question, I actually don't think it makes sense to like separate the moral value function from the utility function. So I think there should just be one thing. It's like your well-being or whatever goes into your utility. And that's the thing we care about. And then we should transform the weights. So yeah, thanks. That's a really helpful question to clarify.
Kyle Bloomberg.
Oh, hey, thanks so much. This is super interesting. I just have a kind of a small question that's related to Clayton's question about the kind of what structure for belief you get on this kind of maximizing view. So I was just wondering about closure. So belief closure seems like a pretty good principle to me, but I was just, there were some things that are written down on page 3, which I feel like could go either way. So you have an example where believing X is higher than believing X or not X. And so that might suggest that you're thinking, yeah, you could be in a situation where you believe X and you don't believe X or not X. But I'm just wondering about that. Does that follow from your system, or are there further things you can twiddle to get closure in your system? I couldn't totally see just from looking at the thing you were writing down. And I think this has got to do with broader things with the Levi system that I'm not totally on board with.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So he, as I was sort of trying to explain, I mean, it's not in the handout at all, but he is thinking pretty holistically. So I think you get closure by definition on his system. I would have to go back and check. My recollection is that, so like, you know, the basic thing is that you have a bunch of atoms, which are like the sort of, I don't know, the simplest propositions, or like the way that you carve things up. And then you're comparing, you know, your options are basically like each individual atom disjoined with each other atom, you know, basically like all the Boolean combinations. And then you compare them all at once and you believe the best one. So if you believe that A will win, then like as a matter of course, you also believe that A or B will win. But here believe as an option refers to the strongest thing you believe. And then you believe all the weaker things that follow from it. So in fact, I mean, I guess it's like a little bit mislabeled in the chart. In fact, believe X in the chart means believe X and X or not X. And believe not X means believe not X and X or not X. So it means like believe X as your strongest belief and then believe everything that follows from it.
That's super helpful. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much.
All right, well, that is the end of our time. So with apologies for those we didn't get to, let's thank our speaker.
Thanks so much, you guys. Great questions.
Thanks, Lara. That was a fantastic way to send us out. You really sent us off in style. Thank you.